Welcome to BYJU'S IAS. We are back again with yet another edition of the weekly review of international relations that is specially curated for you, dear candidates who are preparing for the civil service examinations. Our effort here, as always, is on focusing on events, individuals and issues that have a direct bearing on India's national interest, and besides, they are the kind of issues, events and individuals who have a far-reaching impact on the general pattern of international relations. And recently what has happened is, what we can witness is a realignment of triangular relationships, one between India, Russia and America, and the other which is Russia, China, America, maybe marginally somewhere in Europe. We shall discuss all this and try to analyze, untangle the skein for you, go back into the historical background. So what are we waiting for? Let's begin. The visit to India of the Soviet Foreign Minister Lavrov provided a unique opportunity to have a retrospective of the Indo-Russian relations and also to see how the relationship has changed in recent past. What are the implications of this changing relationship? We are old friends, but do old friends retain the same strategic significance when time passes? And lots of things happened during this visit which made us think about different things. First of all, when Lavrov came, it appeared from the Indian side that the visit was being downgraded a little. Ostensibly, Lavrov had come to India to prepare the ground for Putin's visit to India sometime later in the year. But normally it is customary when the foreign minister of Russia comes, he, for at least the sake of courtesy, is in his itinerary and an agenda, there is a meeting with the prime minister. This time it was made clear to the Russian foreign minister that for a variety of reasons the prime minister was busy battling the COVID virus pandemic. He was busy in the election campaigns all across the country. And then the problem was, somehow or other, it could not be fitted in during this tight schedule. Obviously, even a 15-minute meeting would have signaled that the Indians valued the Indo-Russian relationship as much as they did in the past. That was one. The reluctance on the part of the Indians to grant this visit any special status was, perhaps it had been communicated to India, it did not come as a surprise, that this was not a standalone visit to India. There were back-to-back visits after India. Lavrov went to Pakistan and was received there with far greater warmth, and he also promised the besieged Pakistani government assurances of economic assistance, about arms deals, etc. But there are other things. When the statements were made after the visit, the two sides put emphasis on different topics. The Indian side kept referring to the Indo-Pacific region and the role India was playing there. The Russian side scrupulously avoided mentioning the Indo-Pacific and kept the older, their preferred version, the Asia-Pacific region. Now the difference between the two descriptions is interesting. Indo-Pacific means India has a significant role in the Pacific region. Asia-Pacific means that India is one of the many Asian countries who have an interest in the Pacific region, and of course China also has an interest in this region, and the Russian foreign minister also made it clear by emphasizing that the Russians do not look forward to any alliances which are something like the Cold War NATO alliances in this region. The reference was, of course, towards Quad. The Indians also were concerned about the Russian proximity with China, and they wanted to be reassured that the coming closer of the Russians and the Chinese in recent past is not going to be an embryonic military alliance, military treaty which balances American presence in this region, but obviously it is going to be detrimental to India. So these two issues were the primary issues. The Russians, of course, tried to reassure Indians that they again resurrected the old plan of the North-South corridor, which had been a decade ago talked up very much about the international gas pipeline, Tapi pipeline. But by now, the world has moved so much away from the North-South corridor or the Tapi pipeline that nobody takes it very seriously. It is also going back to a past which may not be very relevant today. I think the concerns which the Russians have is that they want India to be drawn away from the American side, but at the same time they know that India in the past decades has gone so much in the strategic partnership with the US that it's difficult going to recreate the special relationship with Russia, or let's say when it was called Soviet Union. Before we proceed any further, I think we should go back to the historical background of this relationship. When the Cold War broke out and India was newly independent, India chose to be a non-aligned country, remain outside the contest of the two power blocs, and India was distrusted both by the capitalist Americans, then led by the Secretary of State like Dulles, who enunciated that whoever is not with us is against us. The same kind of a mentality was visible in Soviet Union, where Stalin thought that the Anglophile Nehru was closer to Britain and closer to the Atlantic Alliance than he was to, despite his socialistic pretensions, to Soviet Union. Indians were criticized as a running log of British imperialism in the Soviet encyclopedia. Things improved only when the Stalinist regime ended and Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union. At this stage, they realized that India was too large a country, too important a country, a leader of the Afro-Asian bloc at that stage, to be neglected or to be alienated. So they decided to give to India what the Western bloc was reluctant to give. The most important thing in this was the use of the Russian veto repeatedly in the Security Council, when the West, trying to side with Pakistanis, was trying to rake up the Kashmir dispute at that forum. So repeatedly the defense provided by the Russians through their veto to Indians sealed this relationship a little. Further reinforcement came when the Russians were more willing to offer India massive technological assistance in diverse fields like steel, like military hardware, like sophisticated optical glass, like chemicals and fertilizers, like life-saving antibiotics and vaccines, like in space exploration, like in oil and gas explorations. So all this over the years forged a relationship between India and the then Soviet Union into a very close relationship. But what transformed this relationship entirely was the year 1971, when the Bangladesh Liberation War was being fought and the Americans were trying to browbeat through their gunboat diplomacy India and trying to protect Pakistan from dismemberment. Mrs. Gandhi did not blink. She signed a treaty of peace and friendship which made it a special relationship. Some would even argue that this was the end of India's non-alignment and India was becoming a nation aligned to Soviet Union. But one would like to add in the same breath here that having said this, that this was changing the relationship, Nehru's definition of non-alignment was very clear. It says non-alignment does not mean remaining neutral under all circumstances. It means taking a decision and aligning with whatever party in the best interest of India was visible at that moment. So keeping the context of the 1970-71 crisis in Bangladesh, which was forced by Pakistan, this treaty was very much relevant in that period. This continued for decades. But since then, India has not been particularly keen to renew this relationship. As long as the relationship was there, the Russians were giving India whatever India wanted at that stage. India had differences with Soviet Union about the Brezhnev doctrine of limited sovereignty of the communist countries. India did not quite support the Soviet action in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in Poland, had its differences about Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. But these differences notwithstanding, the Chinese invasion of India in 1962 made it very clear to the world that the Russians may rhetorically say that the Chinese were brothers, Indians were friends, but they had decidedly been on the side of India in the long strategic view. The Chinese were very unhappy about this. This was the time when the Sino-Soviet rift was coming to surface. There were clashes on the Ussuri River banks, bloody military clashes, and the Russians were closer to India at this time than any other time and had drawn apart from People's Republic of China as much as they could at a particular time. Now, having all this in mind, India was becoming increasingly dependent for its military hardware purchases on the Russians. There were MiG fighter aircraft, there is helicopters, ANs, there were tanks, and there were heavy weaponry. There was some assistance given to India in space exploration, and the Indian astronauts rode in Russian rockets to orbit the Earth. Now, all this made India and Russia very close to each other. Things changed once again when there was a thaw in the Cold War. The Cold War ended. Nixon and Kissinger normalized the relationship after ping-pong diplomacy and visits to Beijing of the American president and the Secretary of State. That normalization of relationship between America and China constrained Russians also to relook at their relationship. This was the time when the European Union was emerging as a multinational, supranational organization, and the Russians were also having turmoil in their domestic politics. Mikhail Gorbachev had talked of glasnost and perestroika. He had endeared himself to the Western nations. And the Russians were undergoing, post the ouster of Mikhail Gorbachev, a period of economic instability and political turbulence. This continued for a long number of years. And in the 1990s, Russia ironically was more dependent on Indian investment in gas and petroleum explorations in Siberia, in Sakhalin, billion-dollar investment. It was dependent for the earnings from India, the purchases of arms, the refitting of the aircraft carrier and so on, and the supplies of spares for the fighter aircraft, etc. It has sold to India. The important thing about the Russian-Indian relationship has been, through the Soviet period and the post-Soviet period, the Russians have not been reluctant to transfer technology required by India. So India has helped indigenization of certain crucial strategic sectors like the defense, thanks to the Russian non-reluctance to part with technology. The West was very, very reluctant to do so. Now there is the field of nuclear energy, where the Russians were very helpful to India at one stage, the heavy water plants, the plutonium fast breeder reactors, but there have been some stresses and strains in that relationship also. This was of course mentioned in the recent visit of Lavrov in India, that this is an important area of cooperation between India and Russia. The references were made to missiles like BrahMos, but interestingly, the missiles S-400, which India wants to cope with the Chinese threat in the north, which the Chinese have also received, the Turkish have also received, but the Americans have made it very clear that if India goes ahead with this deal, India might become vulnerable to the sanctions which Americans have imposed on others who buy this kind of a weaponry with Russians. India also is very keen that the technology transfer also takes place simultaneously when the S-400 is bought by India. The Russians have agreed in principle to supply what India requires, but also they are uncomfortable that Indians, perhaps in their eagerness not to displease the Americans, are delaying the purchase and deployment of these. They are saying that the deal is on, they will be deployed when they required, but this leaves it in an open market. As far as the Russians are concerned, obviously they are not too happy about India diversifying its resources of defense deals. It has bought Rafale, now controversial deal, from France. It has diversified its purchases from Israel. It has bought some things from Canada, and it continues to have a relationship with the United Kingdom, France and Germany, bits and pieces. Russians would like the largest chunk of the share to remain with them. This has not quite happened. Another thing which was negotiated during this visit was the Sputnik 5 vaccine. Now, the whole world is coping with the vaccine shortage. There are all kinds of apprehensions about side effects of certain vaccines. Some require very high degree of low temperature to be useful. Some have side effects. Some have cost variation. And also, there are some countries which are reluctant to part with a vaccine on India's terms, when they think that the vaccine development was done by them or by their companies, and India only is a manufacturing partner. So the Serum Institute of India has been given a notice by the AstraZeneca company. European nations want the Indian companies to supply and meet their requirements. So that's where the Soviet Sputnik 5 vaccine comes at a particularly strategic time to India's rescue. Now, India obviously is not going to, India will diversify its resources of vaccines all over the world, but obviously it would try to avoid getting a Sinovac, the Chinese vaccine, when we have tensions with China on the other border. All that apart, briefly where it leaves us is that the Russian-India relationship is important for both sides, but not as sensitive strategically as it once was. And to make matters worse, when the Russian foreign minister was India, when he went to Pakistan, he said he had to go there because in the context of the crisis in Afghanistan. The Taliban and the Afghan government talks have not progressed satisfactorily. They conceded India's interest and concerns in Afghanistan, but interestingly did not invite India to this six-partite talks which is trying to break the impasse in Afghanistan. Strangely, it was the Americans who invited India to join and keeping its interest in Afghanistan in mind to participate in the negotiations. The things were made worse by the actions of Americans who sent a warship to explore the freedom of navigation in India's exclusive economic zone in the Arabian Sea just off the Lakshadweep atolls. Now, interestingly, once this was done, the Americans who talk of a rule-based international system seem to flout this totally. First of all, they had not bothered to take consent from India. When the controversy broke out, they said even in the past they have done this and the consent has not been taken. It is not required in international law. It may be stipulated in UNCLOS, to which the US is not a party, but the whole point was it left a bad taste in the mouth because the Indians realized that despite the hype about the Quad, they were not being taken as equal partners. It was almost the Americans, to borrow Field Marshal Ayub Khan's biography's phrase, were acting like masters, not friends. And even if in the past they had not taken consent from India for these freedom of sea navigations, it had not been made public. This time the Americans made it a point to announce publicly that no consent from India had been received, but they had gone ahead with their exploration of the freedom of the seas doctrine here. Now, which means that they were making no difference between adversaries and allies. The Chinese are treated as adversaries. The primary threat is from China in the Straits of Malacca, the Bay of Bengal, the South China Sea, and in the Pacific. But even on the Arabian side, the Chinese would have been more important because the maritime trade passes through this area. But the American action made Indians think that whether they had not done an unwise thing by putting all their eggs in the American basket. So what we are left with is to analyze in the coming days the changing dynamics of Indo-Russian and Indo-American relationships at the same time. Will India be in a position to strike the right balance? Remains to be seen. Certain interesting and unexpected events and incidents in Iran and its neighborhood have forced us to think about the realignment of forces, the power equations which is taking place in this region, the Central Asia, the Middle Asia, the West Asia, and also Israel in this context. This is a relationship which is involving America very strongly. It involves Europe to a certain extent, and on the fringes, on the periphery, you have the Saudi Arabs. But before we proceed any further, let's see what is the incident which is causing us all this turmoil. There was an agreement signed in 2015 between the United States of America and Iran. This was some kind of a compromise solution that Iran would open its nuclear installations for international investigation under the inspection of International Atomic Energy Commission, and it would cap its program of weaponization. It would fill up with the metal, the plutonium-based fast breeder reactors. It would close the hard water plants, and it would confirm repeatedly that its nuclear program was only for peaceful purposes. The moment Trump came there, he reneged unilaterally on this agreement. He said, no, I don't trust the Iranians. I will impose fresh sanctions, additional sanctions on them. I don't think that they are being very honest, they are being devious. And of course, Trump was backing to the hilt the Israelis. And the Israelis have always argued that they are the primarily most threatened nation with the Iran's development of nuclear weapons, and they claim something very oddly, that they have a right to preemptively strike at Iran and destroy their nuclear facilities before it becomes too dangerous for them to handle. Now, interestingly, the Iranian argument obviously is that they are a sovereign nation, they are perfectly entitled to develop their nuclear weapons program or nuclear program, energy program for peaceful purposes. Nobody else should emasculate their weapons program if is required. The interesting part is this, that Iran's nuclear program was started with US assistant. When Raza Shah Pahlavi was the emperor, the US in 1960s, late 1960s, started this program. But within a decade, when there was a regime change, there was an Islamic revolution, and the mullahs took over in Tehran, a period of great skirmish between USA and Iran started. The American embassy was sieged. American diplomats were held hostage for more than a year. America froze Iranian funds in American banks, and this ill will has continued. Ever since then, the US has tried to put Iran on the defensive, treat it as a pariah. So either it is an Iran-Iraq war or it is economic sanctions against Iran, Americans threatening that anybody who deals with Iran would also be vulnerable to these sanctions. So Iran's oil exports have been terribly affected. Iran's foreign exchange earnings have been affected. Iran has been ostracized, and Iran has been vilified and demonized as a country which is a rogue state. Now, to go back to the nuclear compromise, when Biden was campaigning for his presidential election, he made it very clear that 2 or 3 things which he would give priority to. He would get back into the climate change agreement, which again Trump had reneged on, and he would restart and resume the dialogue with the Iranians on the agreement for development of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Israelis did not like this at all, and Netanyahu made it very clear that he would not accept this at all. But he realizes that Trump is no longer in the White House. Biden was a very, very important individual who negotiated this deal when he was the vice president. And the Iranians have nominated a person who had then dealt with him as an interlocutor in these talks. Right now at the moment, 6-nation talks are going on in Vienna, where the Europeans are very keen that this kind of a violation of a treaty commitment should not be there, and Iran should be allowed to transparently lay open its nuclear program, and then the sanctions can be withdrawn. As far as Iran is concerned, they insist that fine, let's not worry about the sanctions imposed earlier, but the additional sanctions imposed by Trump should first be withdrawn. Then the Americans or anybody else can expect the Iranians to make a concession or a compromise. The worst part of all this is that while these diplomatic efforts are on to normalize the relationship with Iran, Israelis have been behaving in a very roguish manner. And what happened recently was that in Natanz, in a place called Natanz, where there are underground facilities for nuclear research and development, very, very sophisticated centrifuges, there was a night-long power outage. So earlier it was thought it was either a human error or somebody locally had betrayed the Iranian interests. But by now it is quite clear, Iranians have not accepted the responsibility, but they are bragging that it was Mossad, their secret service agency, which mounted a cyber attack on the industrial control systems in Iran, and this is what has resulted in this. Now, 2 interesting things here. Iranians are not liked by its immediate neighbors. Forget about Israel, because Iran is a Shia nation, and all the Sunnis, the UAE, the Saudi Arab, the Turkish, are reluctant to live in peace with Iran. Iran has also never made a compromise or a concession in its support of Shias in Lebanon or participating in the war in Syria, and also supporting the Houthi Shias in Yemen. And these elements, supported by Iran, weaponized by them, have gained confidence to mount attack on oil refinery establishments in Saudi Arabia using drones and so on. In the recent past, a whole lot of events have taken place which it's difficult to judge that Iran is not really a victimized country. Iran had a ship docked in Red Sea area, ostensibly to control piracy in the notorious seas around coastline around Somalia, but this ship has been attacked. It attacked with limpet mines. It was not mortally wounded. The ship avoided suffered no losses. No lives were lost. There were no major repairs were called for, but it showed the vulnerability of the Iranian ships in this area. At the same time, the adversaries of Iran say that the ship is ostensibly there to fight piracy, but it is used to lend support to Houthis in Yemen, or to have drone attacks, or to monitor strategically this area, and it cannot be allowed to continue. Even otherwise, Israelis have carried out systematic targeted assassinations of top-notch nuclear scientists in Iran like Fakhrizad. They have mounted sabotage in nuclear facilities even before, and Iran has repeatedly vowed revenge, but somehow or other, besides token actions against some US forces deployed in Syria, etc., it has not really crossed the line to provoke greater retaliation. Soleimani was killed, a top-notch Iranian general, and it created a lot of resentment in Iran that Iran is not hitting back. This time also in Natanz, the Iranians have said they will give a fitting reply at the right time to Israel. Now, this leads us to another interesting situation of the threat of cyber wars. It is not only the Israelis who have been using these cyber attacks on Iran, sort of having outages in its power system. Iranians have also been accused of mounting cyber attacks on water purification plants in Israel, which again is a life-threatening situation for the Israelis. Chinese have had cyber attacks against the Americans. The British have been constrained to admit that they have a defensive cyber attack capacity to hold back attacks on their own. Now, interestingly, the sanctions against Iran denied not only the foreign exchange but upgradation of its technology. So the industrial control systems which Iran uses are many years old, supplied by Siemens, a German company, and the Israelis are privy to how they can hack this system, and the Iranians are now claiming, like they are claiming they are having an independent development of a vaccine, they are developing a security patch against hacking, but let's see how long it takes. So as long as this is there, we also have to worry about India's relationship in this area. Iran in recent past has drawn close to Pakistan, has drawn close to China. Iran's nuclear weapons program, when it was paralyzed due to sanctions, was conducted through nuclear piracy of A.Q. Khan of Pakistan, some cooperation with North Koreans, some assistance from China. So there is a long backdrop of Iran slowly trying to protect its sovereignty through assistance received, except Pakistan, which is a dependent state, a vassal state, not only of China but of America, now also dependent on Russia. So, but these Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans are apparently superficially on opposite sides. But when it comes to Iran, trying to protect Iran's oil trade, no country, including India, can afford to disregard American threats or pressures and deal with Iran directly. But China has no such compulsions. The Russians have no such fear. And also, the Iranians have been dealing in oil in a roundabout manner, in cash, in kind, with other countries as far away as Venezuela. So India, under American pressure, has abstained when there is a vote against Iran. It has at times disappointed the Iranians. We have gone away from our commitment that we have civilizational millennia-old ties with Iran. But the net result is that can we disregard this changing play of power equations and dynamics in Middle East and in West Asia, with Iran on the fringes in Central Asia? It is approximate to Afghanistan, and it is very close to the Russian underbelly. So this is another area where India will have to be very cautious. India will have to try to balance its vital interests, define them, and then say what is happening between the other major powers. That's all we have for you this week. But before we goodbye, I think it is necessary to have a quick recap of what we have reviewed. A very important development has been in Indo-Russian relationship and how it is affected by Indo-American relationship. The Indo-Russian relationship is a time-tested relationship, a very special relationship. It remains a very important relationship because the Russians cannot do away without India. If India, the second most populous nation in the world, fifth largest economy in the world, goes to the other side, the balance is tilted against the newly emerging socialist bloc of the, you may call it the Cold War redux, the Russians and the Chinese on one side, and Americans, European Union, and Indians on the other side. It would be definitely disadvantages for Russians because the Chinese would have the primacy and pride of place in this new relationship. Russians would no longer be the big brother. They can explain that their interests are more on the European side, not on the Asian side. But for distant future, it is a situation which is very uneasy. The Russians would not accept this, especially under Putin. Then again, the Chinese, what happens to China, in foreseeable future, she will remain very much in power, but would he be able to manage the adverse impact on economy of COVID? Would he be able to spread himself all across and bear the cost of the One Belt, One Road, which is faltering under the impact of COVID and under the failure of the partner countries where he had extended it all over the place. So India in coming days would have to maintain a very delicate balance between its relationship with America and Russia and try not to alienate any of them to an extent. But at the same time, the Americans will also have to perhaps be advised firmly, politely to watch their step. They cannot snub India by overtly saying that they treat India and China alike, the adversaries and friends alike. At the same time, you cannot treat Indians as the most important member of the Quad and still trespass into their exclusive economic zone. True, they do not have to do under international law a declaration, but this time the mistake they made was to make public very bluntly what they were doing. Similarly, the Russians, when they are trying to equate Pakistan and India and not allowing India to join in a talk on Afghanistan or something, are conveying signals that the relationship has changed from their point of view also. Please bear this in mind and think about it. The second thing is about Iran. Iran is a country with which India has centuries-old cultural relationship, important economic relationship as an importer of oil from that country. But under American influence and pressure, if I may say so, we have let this relationship get a little sour. But this relationship means that if India is the second largest concentration of Shia Muslims in the world after Iran, if we keep that in mind, there would be some pull towards Iran, not only among Muslim Shias, but because we have a cultural affinity with this country, there always will be a relationship with Iran and Persia, which will be at the back of our mind. At the same time, we cannot afford to opt out of Iran. At one time, we were an important partner in the upgradation of Charbagh port, but right now, we are out of it. Iran has gone closer to China, closer to Pakistan, and also if Iran continues to support the rebels in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, the rest of the world would not share our perspective on this situation. Also, we must keep in mind that India in recent past has been drawing very close to Israel strategically. So we cannot say that we are totally oblivious or we can remain indifferent to what Israel is doing vis-a-vis Iran, whether it's a preemptive strike, which is unacceptable in international law. At the same time, we cannot be a major purchaser of military hardware from Israel and say that what they are doing in this region is totally wrong. So we can't oppose them openly, and whether the normalization of relationship between Israel and Saudi Arab and UAE would continue post-Trump era is something worth watching. Israel itself is not in a very stable political state, 4 elections in 2 years, and there might be yet one more, the voters suffering from voter fatigue, and also the division between hawks and doves in Israel. Similarly, there are hawks and doves in Iran, and dare I say, there are hawks and doves in India. So we will have to watch this situation carefully. Please ponder over it till we meet next time. Thank you.